For a few years now, there's been a much bigger push for remakes / remasters and just straight up re-releases, and I'm usually all for them since they used to only be needed for games that were locked to an old console or just to test the waters of getting a new game in a series. Both great reasons, but now, we're not really getting that. But before going into that, since people just throw remake and remaster around when they're talking about the opposite thing, let's do what everyone's English teacher should have taught them and actually define those words. So remasters have graphical changes, usually some type of additional content that was either cut from the original or just packages the DLC together. But the most important thing is that they maintain most of, if not all of the feel of the OG. Remakes take concepts found in the original, but gameplay, graphics, and the story are usually greatly changed or just a little tweaked. A remake should have a different experience than the original, while a remaster is essentially the exact same thing with a new coat of paint. Now, there's actually a lot of games that are difficult to categorize, like with the Reignited trilogy. It was built from the ground up, and there's gameplay changes that technically do completely change things like Spyro's movement, but considering the fact that they did that to unify the games while making sure everything else was faithful to the OGs, I consider it still a remaster. Okay, now with all that being said, how can you even say if a remaster or a remake is unnecessary? If there's a graphical update with little tweaks to the quality of life, shouldn't that justify it on its own? No! Well, at least not to me. Now, the main reason why I even wanted to make this video was because of both the Spider-Man and Last of Us remasters. Even though they really want to call The Last of Us a remake, I'll get into it. For the Spider-Man release, it's obvious that remaster to them meant more of a definitive version because it's not like the graphical changes were very noticeable aside from Peter's new face, and the content changes were just little additions like the new suits. I still believe that this stuff could have, and probably should have, been patched in, or even better, if Sony would just treat their game libraries better, it could have carried over, but whatever. My bigger issue comes from The Last of Us remake. Now, it's always subjective to whether or not a game deserves to be remade, especially when it's in a popular franchise, and while I do think that making it more in line with Part 2 is cool, it comes across as incredibly cash grabby for a couple of reasons. The first is that this game already had a remaster. I already didn't think that was necessary since the game wasn't even a year old when that was first announced, but that really just goes into Definitive Edition and remaster always being intertwined. But when it comes to the remake, here's the list of changes that are supposed to justify its existence. Improvements to the AI, animations and general improvements to graphics, new modes, combat fluidity, whatever that means, accessibility, and taking advantage of the DualSense. As someone who is not a game developer and really has no idea how difficult it may be to include things, none of these seem like something that would warrant an entirely new game. Sure, tweaking the AI, both enemy and friendly, are good to make the game more interesting, especially with how some of the AI in the old one was a little finicky. I personally don't have any problems with how the original looked. In fact, in some places I think it's better, but I'm fine wanting to make them fit more with Part 2. But aside from that, I don't see the point of releasing the exact same game 3 times on 3 different consoles. I also feel like while the new facial animations do convey way more emotion, some of them feel like they're overly emoting and it's missing the more subdued ways the original handled certain scenes. But I feel like that also might have more to do with just intention, art direction, and in some cases just straight up hindsight. Then for the new modes, I wouldn't even really consider them modes since they don't really change the game that much, and considering that they were also both possible in the original with just a little bit more effort on the player's side. In permadeath mode, just delete your save if you die, and for speedrunners mode, just have a clock next to you. The DualSense has a lot of interesting features that can make the experience more immersive, but I don't see it as anything more than a gimmick. Adding more accessibility options is always good and should just be standardized across the industry, but I have a hard time believing that you needed to remake a game to include button remapping, changing the HUD, and some gameplay options. But again, if I'm wrong that this is enough work that justifies an entire new release, then cool. This is the new definitive version of the game that got a definitive version a little over a year after its initial release. To me, this comes across as Naughty Dog putting this out while working on the standalone multiplayer that's absent from this game as a way to squeeze out a little more money from people. And I haven't even really talked about how this is a $70 game with technically less less overall content than the previous two versions, which should be a video all on its own on why games being released on modern consoles that don't even take full advantage of the new hardware shouldn't cost more just on the strength. But I think that deserves a little bit more depth than this. Games that justify being remade are those that give you different experiences, both in the story and how it's presented, or going in a brand new direction entirely. That's not what this is. This isn't one of the new Resident Evil remakes, and it damn sure ain't Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I do have problems with, especially with how it's being released, but at least it makes sense. This is really just a fancy remaster that they built from the ground up to give you the exact same experience. And because of how big Naughty Dog is, I'm worried that that's going to continue. Naughty Dog and Sony are leaders in the industry for a reason. Even with my problems with them, they've earned their spot. But instead of focusing their efforts on remakes, remasters, and new games that will continue to push gaming forward, they're working on this. Naughty Dog already has a perfect series that desperately needs love because it hasn't been seen in almost 2 decades in a genre that people are obviously excited for, seeing how well the Crash and Spiral remasters were received, or even looking at smaller games like Destroy All Humans getting remade. This could all just be my bias, and I'm sure that there's some people out there who are genuinely excited to play the same game with a new coat of paint, but I'd rather accessibility options not be put behind a premium for a decades-old game with graphical changes that don't even justify it, even outside of what I want. Why would you want to spend $70 on a game from 2013 that usually goes for $20 just for the new graphics? There's no new story content, there's no new way to experience the story, so what's the draw for you personally? Even as a lowly 2K player, I can say that I'm at least playing with friends or want to make a different build and play a different position. You can't say that for this type of game. And while The Last of Us Part 1 isn't the first time that a game that didn't need to get remade / remastered got that treatment, it's definitely the most high profile and seemingly the one with the most support behind it. Although after I started writing this and doing some research for footage, I've seen more people come out against it, so maybe the tides are shifting. One thing that I miss, and I think people who do agree with me are missing though, is that this remake could have been made for people who never played the original, and Naughty Dog wanted the first timers to have the best experience possible, and since they obviously have the resources, they did it. But that hasn't been who I've seen championing this. It's the people who have already played through it multiple times already. And again, this isn't even the first time that remasters felt like cash grabs. Batman Return to Arkham actually comes to mind for remasters that literally didn't seem to improve anything of note and felt more like something that Rocksteady had to do to retain the license or something, and because it doesn't even include Origins or Night, it feels like an incomplete package. Super Mario 3D All-Stars was, is, and will always be a disaster considering the fact that even calling them remasters is being very generous, and the list goes on and on and on with remasters and remakes that don't tangibly improve on anything, or at worst, makes the games worse. Maybe it's the fact that I really would like to see games like Ape Escape or Sly Cooper make a big comeback, and seeing a game that I think is perfectly fine get a full-on remake just doesn't feel right. And with how some people are calling for a remaster instead of just a port of Bloodborne, I only see it getting worse. And for those actually defending it, I've seen the argument that this remake in particular is like a remastered version of a movie, which actually proves my point that it's unnecessary, because unless you're talking about some movie from the 60s that had a bad reel but was released anyway, there's no reason for it to exist. People now can enjoy those old movies, and having them upscaled to 4K isn't necessary to enjoy something from like 40 years ago. A movie being remade like Ocean's 11 or Scarface that fundamentally feel different when you watch them because they're doing different things or the focus is different would actually be worth buying. But again, I'm always wondering what the actual value of something is and if I think it's worth being created. Even this video, I question how important it is to share my perspective. I was never going to play part 1 to begin with. Not because I don't like the game or series, but I've seen it already. And the little micro changes to the animations isn't going to change the emotional weight of any of the scenes to me. And the main reason that I made it the focal point of this was really just because of a trend that I fear will become even more prevalent as time goes on. And with how some reviewers have said, hey, this game is great, it's not worth buying, but it sure is great, really has me conflicted. The work that the people put into remaking the game should be commended, and since they didn't do too much to improve things in my eyes, of course the game is good because the original was good. But on the other side, taking development time away from things like the multiplayer or potential other games just for this leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Unlike games like Spyro or that Prince of Persia remake that might not even come out at this point, they would have been difficult to port, or in all honesty, just wouldn't have been acceptable to modern audiences. When it comes to Naughty Dog's more realistic style of games, they've all kind of played the same, and it's not like the graphics from the PS3 era, especially the end of it, are so terrible that you can't play the games anymore. So what's the need? Games like Ratchet & Clank, Yakuza Kiwami 2, Medieval, and Mafia are all examples of games that make sense for a remake. They're all on consoles from at least 2 or 3 generations back, where the graphics and certain gameplay standards just don't hold up anymore, and all bring something that gives an experience that feels similar, but isn't just a complete reskin. And mayhaps most importantly, they were all priced accordingly. None of them were $60, and even though Yakuza Kiwami was the closest at around $50, considering that they couldn't just port a PS2 game to the PS4 without it being terrible, and adding additional modes and content like with the Majima storyline that's new, I don't really mind that. But part 1 costing more than some AAA titles on the same console and having less content than the original just doesn't make sense to me. And I want to make it clear that this isn't a Sony or only PlayStation issue. I already mentioned the Mario collection, but Nintendo does this with pretty much most of their legacy games. When we get one Link's Awakening, even though it's still too expensive, we get Skyward Sword re-releases or just nothing, because Nintendo likes to make everything more difficult than they need to be. Because Xbox has focused so much on backwards compatibility, it has negated some of my issues because you can just easily play the original, but it's not perfect, and since they've stopped with porting OG games, they never ported Blanks 2, which is unforgivable and may actually be the worst offense I've talked about in this video. And just porting those games doesn't help when some games could really benefit from a modern touch-up. Voodoo Vince got a remaster, and even though no one asked for it, it's still better than just porting it, because sometimes good games don't hold up the same after a few decades. Outside of the big 3, publishers are doing what they can to offer decent remakes, like Square Enix, even though of course they're not perfect. Even Demon's Souls, which is a remake that doesn't change anything, but because game development has come a very long way since '09, it's like a brand new game. Again, if part 1 is something that you've been looking forward to because you're a big fan of the series, then fine. I'm really not trying to take any of that enjoyment away. I just don't want remakes and remasters that feel extremely unnecessary, saturating the market any more than they already do. I'd hate for Cuphead to get a remaster in 2 years that only adds a shot counter and a new silverware mode where you can get like little cracks in your character, all for the low price of $60, which is $20 more than the OG, by the way. The only thing that I can actually do is say my piece, hopefully get some people to take a step back and not buy the same game for the 3rd time in 10 years. And yes, I realize how that sounds after I tried to defend my 2K addiction earlier in the video. But even with all that ranting, most remakes and remasters do the most important thing they can do. They bring old games to new platforms, and when it's something that can't be easily ported, they're successful in my eyes because they bring new people to experiences that used to be out of reach. I just hope that definitive editions disguised as remasters and remakes that give almost the exact same experience stop coming out as frequently, and gems from the past that either didn't get the love they deserve or just haven't been ported anywhere are moved up the line. But let me know what you think. Are you gonna buy part 1 again? Or what's a game you wish could actually get a new coat of paint? Let me know in the comment section below. Mayhaps like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.